The body floating in Crystal Lake wasn't moving. Jake Sullivan had pulled plenty of dead animals from Wyoming's unforgiving wilderness, but something about this one made him stop cold. As he set down his coffee and squinted through the October morning mist, one thought echoed in his mind: this shouldn't be here. The small form bobbed gently against the dark water, black and white markings stark against the surface. A Mustang foal. Maybe 3 months old. Far too young to be alone. Far too still to be alive. Jake's boots crunched on frost-covered grass as he approached the water's edge, his heart already sinking. Another casualty of the brutal early winter that had been decimating the wild herds. But as he stepped into the numbingly cold lake, something felt wrong about the scene. Why wasn't the body sinking? Why did it look so peaceful? Quick pause. What country are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? Let us know in the comments. We love seeing how far these stories travel. The icy water soaked through Jake's jeans as he waded deeper, each step bringing him closer to what he assumed would be heartbreak. This fourth-generation rancher had seen nature's cruelties before, but losing young ones never got easier. The foal's beautiful paint markings would have made it stunning as an adult, if it had lived to see spring. Jake reached out with weathered hands, preparing himself for the weight of death. His fingers touched the small neck, expecting cold, lifeless flesh. Instead, he felt something that made his world stop. A pulse, the faintest flutter beneath his fingertips. His heart nearly exploded in his chest as he leaned closer, pressing his ear to the tiny chest. There, barely perceptible, the shallow rise and fall of breathing. This foal wasn't dead. It was clinging to life by the thinnest thread, suspended between worlds in a way that defied every law of nature Jake knew. But how long had it been in this freezing water? And what had brought it here in the first place? Without hesitation, Jake scooped the limp body into his arms, feeling the weak heartbeat against his chest. The foal was unconscious, dangerously cold and barely breathing, but alive. Somehow, impossibly alive. As he rushed toward the ranch house, Jake had no idea he was carrying a miracle. He didn't know that this moment would test everything he believed about love, sacrifice, and letting go. All he knew was that he held a life in his hands. A life that had survived something that should have killed it. The real question wasn't how this foal had ended up floating in Crystal Lake. The question was whether Jake Sullivan had the strength to save it, and later, the courage to set it free. Because sometimes, love means making the hardest choice of all, and sometimes, miracles come with a price that breaks your heart to pay. What had driven this baby into the water? And why was it still fighting when everything told it to give up? Jake burst through the back door, his soaked jeans dripping onto the kitchen floor. Sarah looked up from her morning coffee, ready to scold him for tracking mud inside. Then she saw what he was carrying. "Dear God," she whispered, her veterinary training kicking in instantly. "Kitchen table, now." Sarah swept breakfast dishes aside as Jake gently laid the unconscious foal down. Her experienced hands moved quickly, checking pulse points and breathing patterns while Jake stood frozen, watching water pool beneath the small body. "How long was it in there?" Sarah asked, her voice clinical, but her eyes filled with worry. "I don't know. Could have been hours, maybe all night." Jake's voice cracked. "Sarah, I thought it was dead, just floating there like..." "Its pulse is weak but steady," Sarah interrupted, her fingers expertly working along the foal's neck. "Core temperature is critically low. We need to warm it gradually, or we could send it into shock." But even as Sarah spoke, something was wrong. The foal's breathing had become more labored. Its body temperature was dropping instead of rising. Time was running out. Sarah grabbed towels from the linen closet, her movements quick but careful. 8 years as a veterinary technician had taught her that hypothermia could kill as easily as drowning. She began drying the foal's coat, while Jake built a fire in the nearby fireplace, both of them working with desperate efficiency. The foal, which they would later name Phoenix, showed no response to their efforts. Its eyes remained closed, its body completely limp. The only signs of life were that fragile heartbeat and the barely visible rise and fall of its chest. "We need to call Dr. Martinez," Sarah said, referring to the local large animal veterinarian. "But in this weather, it'll take her at least an hour to get here." Jake was already reaching for his phone when Sarah's voice stopped him. "Wait," she leaned closer to the foal, her breath catching. "Look at its nostrils." Jake peered down and saw what had caught her attention. The tiniest flutter of movement as the foal's breathing became slightly more pronounced. Still unconscious, but something was changing. Was it getting stronger, or was this the final fight before giving up? "The warming is helping," Sarah observed, continuing to massage the foal's legs to stimulate circulation. But Jake, Even if we can stabilize it, this little one is going to need round-the-clock care. The unspoken reality hung between them. Foals separated from their mothers, this young rarely survived, even with intensive care. Without its mother's milk, warmth, and protection, this baby would need constant feeding, medical attention, and more luck than most miracles allowed. As if sensing their doubts, the foal's breathing suddenly became more shallow. Its heartbeat, which had been growing steadier, began to weaken again. "No, no, no," Jake whispered, placing his hand gently on the small chest. "Don't you give up on us now." Sarah's eyes met his across the kitchen table. They both understood what they were facing. This wasn't just about saving a life. It was about committing to something that could break their hearts. But as Jake looked down at the tiny Mustang lying so still on their kitchen table, he felt something stir deep in his chest. This wasn't just any abandoned foal. This was a fighter who had somehow survived being submerged in freezing water. If Phoenix, yes, that name felt right. If Phoenix had the will to keep fighting, Jake was determined to give it every chance to live. "Make the call," Jake said firmly. "And Sarah, start heating some goat's milk. We're going to save this little one." Over the next hour, as they waited for Dr. Martinez, Phoenix's condition fluctuated like a roller coaster. Moments of hope when its breathing strengthened were followed by terrifying dips when it seemed to fade away entirely. Sarah monitored vital signs, while Jake maintained the warming protocol, both of them learning that miracles don't happen in straight lines. Then, just as Dr. Martinez's truck pulled into the driveway, Phoenix's eyes fluttered open for the first time, dark brown, confused, but unmistakably alive. "There you are," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome back, little fighter." But even as relief flooded through him, Jake had no idea what they'd just committed to. Saving Phoenix's life was only the beginning. The real challenges, the ones that would test everything he believed about love and freedom, were still ahead. Could a wild Mustang foal raised by humans ever truly be free? And what happens when the very bond that saves a life becomes the thing that might destroy it? 3 weeks later, Jake stood at his kitchen window watching Phoenix gallop across the pasture, and his heart broke a little more with each powerful stride. The foal had grown magnificent, legs longer and stronger, coat gleaming with health, eyes bright with intelligence. But something else had grown too, the wild spirit that made Phoenix what it truly was. And now, that spirit was about to get it killed. Dr. Martinez had arrived that morning with news that shattered Jake's world. "The Bureau of Land Management is moving up their roundup," she announced grimly. "They'll be here next week. Jake, if they find Phoenix on your property, they'll classify it as a captured wild horse. You'll lose any legal claim." The words hit like a physical blow. Phoenix would go straight to government holding facilities, concrete pens where wild Mustangs often died of broken spirits, never to run free again. "There has to be something we can do," Sarah pleaded, her voice desperate. "Some legal protection." Dr. Martinez shook her head. "Phoenix is too young to have been part of any documented herd. Legally, it's an orphaned wild Mustang, which makes it government property." Jake watched Phoenix through the window. The young horse standing alert at the fence line, ears pricked toward the distant mountains where its heritage called. In that moment, Jake realized something that nearly destroyed him. Saving Phoenix's life had been the easy part. Now he faced the impossible choice that would define both their futures. That evening, Maria Santos arrived at the ranch. The 52-year-old Mustang advocate had heard Phoenix's story and came with a proposal that sounded like madness. "There's only one way to save Phoenix from the holding pens," Maria said quietly. "We have to teach it to be wild again." Before the roundup, Jake felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Phoenix is barely 6 months old. You're talking about sending a baby into one of the harshest winters on record. "I'm talking about giving it a chance at freedom," Maria replied. "A slim chance is better than certain death in captivity." But the cruelest part of Maria's plan wasn't the danger. It was what Jake would have to do to prepare Phoenix for survival. He would have to break the bond that had saved the foal's life. Wild Mustangs survive through weariness, Maria explained. "Phoenix needs to learn to be suspicious of humans again. Even though it goes against every instinct you have, Jake, you'll have to teach it not to trust you." The next morning began the most heartbreaking chapter of Jake's life. Following Maria's guidance, he started approaching Phoenix with threatening gestures, making loud noises, creating negative associations with human contact. Each time Phoenix tried to nuzzle his shoulder, their nightly ritual, Jake had to push it away. Phoenix's confusion was devastating to witness. The young Mustang would approach with its usual trust, only to be met with rejection and intimidation. Jake could see the hurt and bewilderment in those dark eyes, the same eyes that had first opened on his kitchen table. By the third day, Phoenix had stopped trying to approach Jake entirely. It kept a wary distance, head high and alert, exhibiting the natural flight responses that might keep it alive in the wild. "It's working," Maria observed, though her voice carried no satisfaction. "Phoenix is starting to remember what it means to be a Mustang." But Jake was dying inside. Every rejection, every moment of fear he created in Phoenix, felt like betraying everything they'd built together. The foal that had once followed him around like a loyal dog now watched him from across the pasture with suspicious eyes. On the final night before the planned release, Jake violated every protocol Maria had established. He went to Phoenix one last time, offering the gentle touch and soft words that had characterized their bond from the beginning. Phoenix hesitated, its new wariness warring with the deep connection they'd shared. The young Mustang's entire body was tense, ready to flee. But after a long moment, Phoenix took a tentative step forward. Then another. Finally, the foal rested its head against Jake's chest, just as it had during those first fragile days of recovery. "I'm so sorry, Phoenix," Jake whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I love you too much to let them cage you. You were meant to run free, even if it breaks my heart to watch you go." As Phoenix stood quietly against him, Jake realized he was facing the ultimate test of love, choosing what was best for Phoenix over what he wanted for himself. Tomorrow, he would open the gates and watch Phoenix disappear into the wild, hoping that 3 weeks of rewilding training would be enough to keep a 6-month-old foal alive in the unforgiving Wyoming wilderness. The bond between them had saved Phoenix's life. Now that same love would have to set it free, even if it meant Jake might never know if his miracle foal survived the choice he was about to make. Could love really mean letting go of everything you wanted to protect? And was Jake strong enough to choose Phoenix's freedom over his own breaking heart? The morning of Phoenix's release dawned crystal clear, with snow-capped mountains gleaming in the distance like a promise of wild freedom. Jake stood at the pasture gate, his hands trembling as he prepared to open it for the last time. Every fiber of his being screamed against what he was about to do. Maria Santos positioned herself nearby, ready to guide Phoenix toward the path that led to open range. "Remember," she said quietly, "once Phoenix leaves, you can't follow, you can't check on it. The only way this works is if you let go completely." Sarah watched from the ranch house porch, tears streaming down her face. Martinez had positioned herself with binoculars, ready to document what they all hoped would be Phoenix's successful return to the wild. Phoenix stood in the center of the pasture, magnificent and alert. The rewilding training had awakened something primal in the young Mustang, a wariness that might just keep it alive. But Jake could still see recognition in those intelligent eyes, a flicker of the bond they'd shared. "Okay, Phoenix," Jake whispered, his voice breaking. "This is your chance to be what you were meant to be." He opened the gate and stepped back, his heart pounding. Phoenix noticed immediately, approaching the opening with cautious curiosity. The young Mustang sniffed the air that carried scents from the wild country beyond, ears pricked forward with interest. For a heartbreaking moment, Phoenix hesitated at the threshold. It looked back at Jake, with an expression that seemed to hold both gratitude and goodbye. Then, as if making a conscious choice, Phoenix stepped through the gate and onto the path toward freedom. Jake watched as the young Mustang began to trot, then canter, then break into a magnificent gallop across the open meadow. Every stride carried Phoenix further from safety and deeper into the uncertain world it was born to inhabit. "Look," Maria breathed, pointing toward a distant ridge. Through her binoculars, Dr. Martinez could see what had caught Maria's attention. "There's a small herd on the northern ridge, 3 mares and a yearling. Phoenix is heading straight for them." Jake's breath caught as he watched the most critical moment unfold. This was the test that would determine Phoenix's fate. Would the wild horses accept a foal that had been raised by humans? The lead mare raised her head, alert to Phoenix's approach. For several tense minutes, the horses evaluated each other across the distance. Then, in a gesture that brought tears to everyone's eyes, one of the mares nickered softly and moved toward Phoenix. "She's accepting him, Doctor," Martinez reported, her voice filled with wonder. "The mare is letting Phoenix approach the herd." Jake watched through his own tears as Phoenix was welcomed into the small Mustang family. The young horse that had nearly died in Crystal Lake was now running free with its own kind, exactly as nature had intended. The bond they'd shared had given Phoenix the strength to survive, and now that same love was setting it free. 3 days later, the BLM roundup began. They found no trace of Phoenix or the small herd that had adopted him. The Mustangs had vanished into the vast wilderness, safe from capture and free to live as their ancestors had for generations. Jake never saw Phoenix again, though he often found himself scanning distant ridges with binoculars, hoping for a glimpse of the horse he'd saved and loved enough to let go. Maria assured him that Phoenix's survival training had been excellent, and that the young Mustang had the best possible chance of thriving in the wild. On quiet evenings, Jake would walk down to Crystal Lake where it all began. Sometimes, just sometimes, he could swear he heard the sound of hoofbeats in the distance, carrying on the wind like a message of gratitude from a wild heart that had never forgotten the man who gave it a second chance at life. Months later, Dr. Martinez received a call from a wildlife photographer working in the area. He'd spotted a small herd of Mustangs that included a distinctive paint horse, black and white markings, about a year old, running strong and free with what appeared to be its adopted family. Jake smiled when he heard the news. Phoenix had done more than survive, it had thrived. The foal that had floated motionless in Crystal Lake was now living the life it was born to live, wild and free in the Wyoming wilderness. Phoenix had taught Jake the most profound lesson about love. Sometimes caring for someone means choosing their happiness over your own comfort. True love isn't about holding on, it's about having the courage to let go when freedom matters more than security. In the end, Jake's greatest act of love wasn't pulling Phoenix from the lake. It was opening that gate and watching his miracle walk away into the wild, knowing he might never see it again, but trusting that love had given them both exactly what they needed. The bond between a man and a wild horse had saved 2 lives that day by Crystal Lake, and taught both of them what it really means to be free.